Hi, folks, and welcome. It is right at 12:30, and thank you for sharing some of your lunch hour with us today here at our Holding West Virginia Utilities Accountable webinar. We've got a really interesting lineup and topic of conversation today, so we are going to go ahead and get started right on time. I see folks rolling into the participant list. And we have a lot to cover today, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. This webinar is being recorded and it will be available. A recording will be sent out to everyone who RSVP'd, and it will be made available on our YouTube channel after it is completed. So if you or someone you know missed it or part of it, you can refer back to the recording. So we're Solar United Neighbors, and we're going to be talking about utility accountability here today. And I am your host for the day. I'm Autumn Long, based here in West Virginia. And I'm very pleased to introduce our lineup of panelists. We have Dave Anderson of the Energy Policy Institute, who will kick us off by framing up this topic with some really interesting examples of recent utility interventions and activities in West Virginia and our neighboring state of Ohio. And after that, we're going to hear from Jamie Van Nostrand of WVU College of Law Center for Energy and Sustainable Development. And Jamie's going to speak to some of the regulatory institutions that are involved in utilities, including the Public Service Commission and the Consumer Advocate, and talk about what these institutions do and the roles that they play in holding utilities accountable in West Virginia. And then finally, we're going to hear from Karan Ireland of the Sierra Club, and she's going to talk about some real world examples of how citizens have gotten involved in utility proceedings and intervened and advocated for themselves and their communities. So without further ado, I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping just to get everyone on the same page here. Some of us are very used to being on Zoom day in and day out, but just so we all are familiar with the platform, we always welcome audience questions, and we will have time for a Q&A at the end. So we'll be taking your questions through the chat feature, and you should see the chat option on the bar on your Zoom screen. You can type a question into that chat function, and when you do that, please select all panelists and attendees to send your message to. The default goes to panelists only, but if you change that default to all panelists and attendees, your fellow webinar attendees will be able to see your question too, and other people might have the same question as you. So that provides for a little more audience interaction and transparency in what's being asked. If you have any problems with sound, video, any technical difficulties, also let us know in the chat. My colleague Liz Veazey is here wrangling the chat and answering questions and technical issues as they come up. And as I mentioned, we will share the recording to this webinar afterwards, so don't panic if you have to leave early or if someone you know isn't able to attend. So without further ado, I will go ahead and turn it over to Dave of Energy Policy Institute to get started from here. Take it away, Dave.
Okay, can everyone hear me?
Yep.
That's good. Hi, my name is Dave Anderson. I'm the Policy and Communications Manager for the Energy and Policy Institute, which is a watchdog group that works to expose utility industry attacks on renewable energy projects and policies. Today, we're going to take a look at two different bailout bills that benefited First Energy and were passed on the same day in 2019 by state lawmakers in West Virginia and Ohio. Go to the next slide. The first up would be West Virginia's House Bill 207, which provided a $12.5 million tax break to the coal-fired Pleasants Power Station, now owned by Energy Harbor, which was formerly known as First Energy Solutions. And it kind of emerged from a bankruptcy as a new company last February. So lots of names. It'll get really confusing. It'll be fun. Next slide. So this bill really just passed in what seemed like a matter of days, and some emails that were obtained by the Energy and Policy Institute, and also some reporters showed that West Virginia's governor, Jim Justice, actually had a meeting at his office with the CEO of First Energy Solutions, their top lobbyist, and some other company executives, as well as a lobbyist for the parent company, First Energy Corp. So kind of a pretty surprising example of asking for a bill and then getting it in the manner of days. And it was snuck into a last minute special session of the state legislature. Go to the next slide. Like a lot of the stories that we see in the utility industry kind of involve the usual routine campaign contributions, where utilities like to give a lot of campaign cash to politicians who do their bidding, whether it's on bailouts or other issues, either after the fact or before. Sometimes it's a thank you after a bill is passed. But this one's also a story of a conflict of interest, because Governor Jim Justice's coal company actually sold company to the Pleasants Power Station, and at the time was being sued by First Energy Solutions for money his firm owed for an over delivery of coal. And there's actually some weird emails in that bankruptcy case where First Energy Solutions is asking him to come get the extra coal he dropped off and bring some money to pay them back for it. So not the type of thing you see every day with the governor in most states. And then if you follow the politics around First Energy and the issue of bailouts nationally or at the state level, you won't be surprised to see that Bob Murray and Murray Energy, the coal producers, showed up in this one as well. They were the biggest coal supplier to the Pleasants Power Station at the time. And as soon as the bill had passed, Governor Justice was invited to a big fundraiser that Bob Murray was hosting for President Trump in West Virginia. And also at that fundraiser was Ohio Governor Mike DeWine, who had just signed another big bailout bill in Ohio. So you can go to the next slide. That brings us to House Bill 6. You may have read some things about this in the news over the past year, especially, or when it passed in 2019. But essentially, the biggest piece of it was $1 billion bailout for First Energy Solutions nuclear plants in Ohio. And that bailout also enabled FES to cancel plans or shutter its coal-fired Samus power plant, which is right on the border with West Virginia, I think, even though that coal plant was never actually mentioned as supposedly receiving the money in the bill. So it's been called a stealth coal bailout in that respect with the Samus plant by environmentalists there. HB 6 also rolled back Ohio's renewable energy and energy efficiency standards that were originally enacted with bipartisan support by the legislature in 2008, something that had long been sought by First Energy and the other utilities and fossil fuel industry there. And First Energy Corp, the parent company and its utilities in Ohio, also benefited from a controversial decoupling provision that basically guaranteed them millions of dollars every year in unearned profits, even during an economic downturn, or as it turned out, a global pandemic, as we've seen play out over the last year. So final piece, kind of complicated, but we won't go into all the different details of the bill. It also provided a big bailout for 2 coal-fired power plants owned by something called the Ohio Valley Electric Corporation, and that's co-owned by AEP, Duke Energy, AES, and several other big major utilities. And Energy Harbor, formerly FES, now owns a piece of those too. So kind of got a piece of multiple bailouts going to Energy Harbor there. Next slide. So 2020, last summer, First Energy and Energy Harbor are sitting pretty in Ohio with that HB6 bailout and all the money coming to them soon from ratepayers. And then suddenly this bombshell announcement came from the US Attorney for the Southern District of Ohio, announcing a big criminal complaint and the arrest of Ohio House Speaker Larry Householder and several political operatives who were alleged to have used a dark money group to receive about $6 million in bribe money from Company A in exchange for the nuclear bailout that was ultimately included in HB6. And this whole scheme played out over several years between like 2017 and 2020. You can go to the next slide. And this is what I was talking about, about how complicated it gets with all the different names. This is an attempt to portray in a graphic all the different entities mentioned in that criminal complaint against former Ohio House Speaker Larry Householder. And essentially what you can see here is the $60 million coming from what federal investigators called Company A, because First Energy hasn't actually been charged in the case yet. But just a few weeks ago actually admitted in a related lawsuit that it was the source of all this secret money. So technically we no longer have to say that it's Company A, probably First Energy. We can say it was definitely First Energy funding this big scheme. Essentially the money passed from First Energy to a dark money group run by Householder and his associates called Generation Now. And it was first used to secure Householder the speaker's position in 2019. And that was done essentially by running ads to support candidates who would support his election as House Speaker in 2018, and also opposed candidates who wouldn't support him. So then they got to work very quickly passing HB6. And when there was a petition campaign mounted to overturn that new law, really the bulk of this money was spent beating back that petition campaign so that wouldn't give voters a chance to overturn the law in 2020. Oh yeah, just a quick note. Before the criminal complaint was filed, I think a lot of people suspected most of this money was coming from First Energy, but it was really hard to prove because it had passed through 501c4 nonprofits that were not required to disclose their donors, and some of it also flowed through for-profit consulting firms, PACs, and other nonprofits. So you already went to the next slide, which is good. After the bribery investigation was made public, First Energy launched an ongoing internal investigation, the findings of which remain largely secret at this point. But one of the bombshells that they have released as part of a slow drip of rather limited disclosures was that they'd paid $4 million to a soon-to-be Ohio state utility regulator. And then we looked even deeper into some of the SEC filings around that. And if you go to the next slide, you can see kind of this remarkable disclosure that a lot of people in Ohio say is about as close as you'll ever get to seeing a company admit that it bribed a public official to do their bidding. And the language is basically literally like that the state regulator received $4.3 million shortly before their appointment, and then took actions that benefited First Energy and at the request of First Energy while they were in that official regulatory position. And all the descriptions of this individual match former PUCO chairman Sam Randazzo, whose home was raided by the FBI last fall, and then resigned a short time later. You can go to the next slide. Lot of other fallout inside of First Energy around this. Its CEO and top lobbyists and several others have been ousted from the company's leadership, mostly since October. And then more recently, they terminated the lobbying registrations of several of their top lobbyists in Ohio too. So I think a lot of people are keeping an eye on the US DOJ and curious about what charges, if any, might roll out next, or who they're talking to behind the scenes, who used to work for the company. Go to the next slide. And Governor DeWine has also been drawn into the fray over election support that he and his daughter, who ran for a county prosecutor position in 2020, received from First Energy. And he, of course, was also the one who appointed Sam Randazzo to his position as PUCO chairman. And it's come out that that was since after multiple meetings towards the end of the 2018 election, where DeWine met with First Energy officials who then gave a bunch of money to the Republican Governors Association to support his campaign. And then met again with First Energy not too long before he chose Randazzo as his PUCO chairman. You go to the next slide. So most of the money involved in the scandal flowed through something called the First Energy Service Companies, which basically provides all sorts of different various services to all of First Energy subsidiaries, and is then paid by those subsidiaries for those services. So that would include like Ohio Edison and companies like Moan Power in West Virginia. And they provide services like external affairs, PAC management, lobbying, and things like that. So they happen to file their own reports with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, basically documenting their annual revenue and spending each year. And in those reports, you could kind of compare the tens of millions of dollars that allegedly flowed through that company to the very small amount of money that they reported to FERC on those annual things. So $60 million of what First Energy has basically admitted now flowed through the service company to these dark money groups involved in the conspiracy, and then actually only reporting 1.2 million in donations and 6.6 million in political expenditures to FERC. So seems to be some serious accounting issues going on there. And EPI did an analysis where we found that the 13 regulated First Energy utilities in 5 different states paid the service company $144 million for external affairs, and that ratepayers may be on the hook for much of the spending because of the accounts that spending was included in, usually being recoverable from ratepayers. So I think we'll see a lot more scrutiny on that front, and are already seeing that from state regulators and FERC itself. You can go to the next slide. So this was an interesting tidbit I found in Moan Power's financial statement for 2020. They're essentially disclosed in their First Energy Corp's big annual report for 2020 and earnings call for the last quarter, that they were admitting that they'd identified certain transactions that in some cases dated back as far as 10 years and included outside services were improperly accounted for and then improperly collected, resulted in money being collected from customers. So it's sort of a lawyerly way to admit like, oh yeah, there's a lot of like evidence that ratepayers probably paid for some of this dark money scheme. And yes, that's true, but we're not going to say it that explicitly. So getting down to the specifics, I think is going to take some time and a willingness by state regulators and others like the SEC, but it's moving forwards at least. And they did admit in this particular annual report from Moan Power that some of the money was collected from customers of Moan Power itself. So pretty spanning and kind of shocking if they're talking about money that was spent in Ohio like this being recovered from customers in West Virginia. Next slide. These are just some of the government agencies that are now investigating First Energy around this HB6 donations and political spending that are caught up in the criminal complaint. I won't go through each one, but probably the most notable would be the Public Utilities Commission of Ohio, which has its own funky links to the scandal, of course, through Sam Randazzo, is doing a bunch of audits. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has an audit and investigation going now. And then the SEC is also subpoenaed First Energy and has an investigation too. And it seems like more state regulators are catching on that ratepayer money from their states might be caught up in this, like New Jersey, and are joining the fund. Next slide. Just a quick note here that there's some weird coincidences between Ohio and other states in terms of political operatives and dark money. Generation Now, the dark money groups that is really at the center of this Ohio bribery case. Their treasurer is a Kentucky lawyer who used to work for Mitch McConnell named Eric Lakin. And he was also the treasurer for a dark money group in West Virginia called Go West Virginia that spent a lot of money helping to elect state legislators there. So always hard to suss out just based on that, whether this is kind of the same type of thing playing out with the same funders. And unfortunately, without the subpoena power, of the federal government, we can't always get those answers easily, but I'd imagine we might hear more about those sorts of things in the future. And that's pretty much it. There's my contact info, and wait till the end for questions.
Wow, thank you, Dave. That is a very quick overview of a truly shocking scandal in scope that is still unfolding, and the reverberations of which we're still, continuing to find out about and learning about. So I think that is a great introduction for laying out the kind of power that utilities wield over, state government decisions in the halls of power, locally, state level, nationally. And that cues us up really well for Jamie's portion of this talk. And Jamie's going to talk about, the types of regulatory bodies and institutions that are in place, whose job it is to regulate and control this industry. So with that, take it away, Jamie, and you can let me know when you're ready to advance slides.
Thank you, Autumn. It's a pleasure to be with you today. Maybe the next slide, Autumn. So what I'm going to do is just provide an overview of our overall electric system, who serves us, what part of the large organizations they are. Spent a lot of time talking about the Public Service Commission, who they are and what they do. I think adding on to what Dave talked about, these commissions have a tremendous amount of power and influence, and most of us don't really know who they are and what sort of authority they do have. And so it's helpful to be aware of that as you think about utility accountability and where do you go when you want to improve the performance of your utilities. And then just briefly talk about in West Virginia we have an office called the Office of Consumer Advocate, which is intended to represent consumers in front of the PSC. Next, Autumn. So this is an overview in terms of what our electric grid looks like in West Virginia. Our surrounding states are much different. Pennsylvania and Maryland, for example, have restructured or deregulated. So you have a choice of suppliers. I'm over here in Western Maryland now, and I'm actually served by Potomac Edison, which is a First Energy affiliate, but I can get my energy from somebody else if I choose to, even though Potomac Edison will still deliver it. West Virginia, we have what is referred to as a traditionally vertically integrated utility system. Basically, there's no retail wheeling. If you're in Morgantown and you're served by Mon Power, you don't have the ability to get your energy from any other supplier. You're going to get it from Mon Power. We have exclusive service territories, which means you have no ability, really no choice in terms of who's going to be your provider. Our two primary electric utilities, the one Dave has been talking about quite a bit, is First Energy. They have two affiliates in West Virginia. One is Mon Power, which serves Morgantown and the northern part of the state, and then Potomac Edison, which serves the eastern panhandle over near DC. And then in the southern part of the state, Appalachian Power, which serves which is an affiliate of American Electric Power. And then up in Wheeling in the northern panhandle, it's Wheeling Power. Those are both affiliates of American Electric Power, which is also based out of Ohio. These are two pretty good sized companies. The thing that I know when in the work that I do, for example, on ramping up energy efficiency, which I'll talk about in a minute, is these utilities in the states surrounding West Virginia know how to offer energy efficiency programs, right? American Electric Power offers lots of programs in the other states in which they serve. First Energy, just last Wednesday, I had an energy audit done at utility expense at my house here in Western Maryland, because it's a very good program offered by Potomac Edison, because the statute in Maryland requires it, and the Public Service Commission in Maryland requires the utilities to offer pretty aggressive energy efficiency programs to help their customers save money and to help their customers manage their energy costs. So both of these companies can provide these kind of services if the regulators require them, or alternatively, if we have legislation that requires it. Next slide, Autumn. So it's also helpful to know the wholesale power markets, which is basically where the grid is operated from. This is the organization that's responsible for keeping the lights on, basically by dispatching the power plants, making sure supply is adequate to meet demand. And it's called the PJM Interconnection, or PJM. It's located in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, but it's part of 13 mid-Atlantic states, and West Virginia is located within this wholesale power market. So to a large extent, when you hear about how coal plants that are owned by our utilities are out of the money, it's because the price, the cost at which they generate electricity is out of market, basically, because PJM operates a very competitive wholesale market where the power plants are dispatched according to how cheaply they can generate electricity. And basically PJM, in this big control room they have in Valley Forge, PA, will keep dispatching power plants until such time as supply equals demand. And if you're bidding in a price that's higher than that market clearing price, you're out of the money. So in the case of many of the coal plants operated by the West Virginia utilities, they're no longer competitive because we have cheap natural gas fired facilities. Now we have wind and solar. And so that competitive dispatch curve operated by PJM when they're operating the grid to make sure that supply equals demand, but it usually are the coal plants, the older coal plants in West Virginia are out of the money. And so that's what we'll talk about in a minute in terms of why First Energy and AEP were motivated to dump their uneconomic power plants on the backs of the West Virginia ratepayers with the blessing of the Public Service Commission. The wholesale markets are regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. So it has, which is FERC. FERC has oversight over what PJM does, the tariffs and the practices of PJM. If utilities want to enter into transactions among themselves at a wholesale level, FERC is the one that sets those, that oversees those prices. FERC is the one that pretty much prescribes the policies that have to be followed by the regional transmission organizations like PJM around the country. So the wholesale level, it's all about FERC. And might have been following in the news lately, there's been, with the election of President Biden, there's been some change in the leadership at FERC. James Danley, who was the chair, was a Trump appointee, is now just a commissioner because President Biden has appointed Rich Glick, the new chair at FERC, and policies are changing pretty rapidly, I gotta say, in terms of some of the things that the Trump administration did to upset the competitive wholesale markets in favor, and to try to put a thumb on the scale in favor of natural gas and coal, and to discourage development of renewables. A lot of those policies are being undone pretty quickly. At the state level, it's all about the Public Service Commission. That's the agency that sets the rates for what Mon Power and Potomac Edison and Wheeling Power and Appalachian Power can charge retail customers. So let's look at what the PSC is and what they do. So one of the things that I want to impress upon everybody is the authority of this agency. Before I moved to West Virginia and got into law school teaching, I practiced law in Seattle and Portland. I did cases in front of 8 different public service commissions around the country, and also did some consulting for the New York Public Service Commission. These agencies are tremendously powerful. They have really broad grants of authority in terms of what they can allow the utilities to do. They really set the tone for the kind of policies that the utilities are going to follow, and the extent to which they represent consumers. You know, they are the watchdogs for us. They're the ones who are supposed to be protecting us from, because these utilities, they are monopolies, right? We give them exclusive service territories. We don't have options. And so we're counting on the regulators to perform that role in protecting consumers from the monopolists charging exorbitant prices. So it's an incredibly important role that they play. And so you need to know, who do we have playing those roles in West Virginia? So the chair is Charlotte Lane. This is her third time on the commission. She was a chair before, then she was appointed by President George H.W. Bush to the International Trade Commission in DC when her term expired. When Obama became president, she came back, was a lobbyist for First Energy for a while, and then ran for the state legislature and was elected, where her largest political donor was First Energy. But now she's back as chair of the PSC. Brooks McCabe has been on there for a few years. So the thing is, they have six-year terms. and they can only be removed for cause. And so that provides the job security. And most commissions around the country are structured the same way. And the statute will say you can have no more than 2 from the same political party, so you don't have them all loaded up with Democrats or Republicans. And then when a new governor is elected, you can only name a commissioner as terms expire. So Mike Albert's term expired, so Charlotte Lane was brought in as the chair, and she has the term that runs the longest, and she was most recently appointed. And then Commissioner Renee Larrick, her term expires in a couple of years, and then Brooks McCabe's term actually expires in June of this year. So these are the 3 commissioners. They act as judges in administrative proceedings. And so when utilities file for rate cases and other regulatory actions, they preside pretty much as judges in a hearing room that looks much like a courtroom. And that's the role that they perform, is evaluating the testimony put on by the utilities, the opposing testimony put on by other parties like CAG and the Consumer Advocate Division and the industrial customers. And then they perform that role, acting very much like judges. And then of course they'll issue a decision at the end of each case. And typically under this commission, they've been 3-0 decisions. It's pretty rare to have a commissioner dissent. It hasn't happened in a while. But anyway, a little background on the PSC. Next slide, Autumn. So as I mentioned before, this authority to set just and reasonable rates is a really broad delegation, that the commission has a lot of discretion in terms of how it strikes that balance between protecting the ratepayers and ensuring that the investors earn adequate returns. It's very difficult to overturn commission decisions in courts, which reinforces the notion they have a lot of power, a lot of authority. They can make a big difference in terms of how they choose to what policies they enact. They oversee the rates and practices, very broad grant of authority. So I listed some things that they could do, but don't. The things that's near and dear to my heart is the integrated resource planning process, because I helped get this legislation passed in 2014 with the help of Tim Manchin, that actually required the utilities to file integrated resource plans. So the first ones were filed in December of 2015. The most recent ones were filed just last December because they're doing it on a 5-year basis. And literally the one that was filed by First Energy in December of 2015, most commissions around the country would have simply rejected it. They did not. They use it as a basis for proposing the Pleasant Station plant transfer. It really wasn't rigorous at all. It didn't require the integrated part of integrated resource planning means you consider energy efficiency and supply side resources generation. You consider them side by side on an equal, consistent basis. First Energies didn't do that. It was truly a horrible piece of work that most commissions, like I say, would have just rejected it. But this commission made it pretty clear we're not going to do much in response to IRPs. You file them and we accept them, and maybe we'll provide a proceeding where parties can intervene and comment on them, but we're really not going to take any action on them other than just accept them. Energy efficiency is the second bullet there. As I mentioned before, First Energy and AEP offer some pretty comprehensive programs in the states outside of West Virginia. In West Virginia, First Energy offers literally nothing in the way of energy efficiency, and it's simply because the Public Service Commission doesn't require it. And AEP, for its part, in its integrated resource plan, it says there's a role for energy efficiency, and the modeling is going to tell us how much energy efficiency we should acquire. And they actually try to expand their energy efficiency programs consistent with what their IRP tells them. And the Public Service Commission staff has basically told AEP, you need to shut down your energy efficiency programs because you already have excess capacity. It doesn't make any sense. Of course, they don't consider about it from the ratepayers' perspective in terms of how to manage your bills. So basically, AEP is able to escape just by maintaining their existing programs, which are not bad, but they're not nearly as extensive as what they offer in the surrounding states. But this is something the PSC could do on its own, to say we were going to require the utilities to ramp up their energy efficiency programs to achieve a certain level of savings. That would give the customers the tools to manage your energy bills, and this commission simply doesn't do it. So we're trying, the last few sessions, we tried to run an energy efficiency resource standard bill, which the legislature would prescribe to the commission certain levels of energy efficiency savings that need to be obtained, but that's not going to have much chance of passage given the influence that First Energy has, and AEP to a lesser extent, in the legislature. Clarify that PPAs are permitted under West Virginia law. This isn't something near and dear to Autumn's heart because technically, if if the solar panel is owned by an entity other than the person who owns the house, then you're a utility and you can be regulated like a utility. Some states can have, the PUCs have taken that rather technical interpretation of a statute and just issue a declaratory order, a ruling clarifying that we don't consider the statute to be should be interpreted in that manner. The commission on its own could probably issue a declaratory order that would obviate us having to go to the legislature for this power purchase agreement bill that we've been running the last 3 years. The last thing is protecting ratepayers from imprudent utility decisions. Basically, they hold the utilities accountable for if they're making bad decisions that cause rates to go up. The Public Service Commission is supposed to be there to protect the ratepayers and hold the utilities accountable for bad decisions that their management makes. Next slide, Autumn. And finally, things it shouldn't do but did. Another subject near and dear to our heart are all these coal plant acquisitions. These are coal plants that formerly were in the unregulated subsidiaries of AEP and First Energy. And once fracking started ramping up big time in the early 2011, 2012, it became quite apparent these coal plants are out of the money. Think about those competitive wholesale markets that I mentioned. These plants were plainly losing money, but the shareholders were bearing those risks. So First Energy and AEP pretty much decided we need to get our shareholders out of this business. We need to unload these uneconomical plants. What should we do? I know, let's bring them to West Virginia and put them on the backs of the West Virginia ratepayers. This is where the Public Service Commission should have stepped up and said, there's a reason the shareholders want to unload these plants. It's because they're money losers, they're losing money, and we're going to protect our ratepayers in West Virginia from the burdens of these uneconomical plants. What did the commission do? It approved all three of them. 80% of the Harrison plant to Mon Power and Potomac Edison, the transfer of the Mitchell plant to Wheeling, the transfer of the Amos plant to Appalachian Power. And in the case of the Pleasant Station plant, FERC actually disapproved it because they saw it was a sham when the First Energy affiliate was trying to sell it to First Energy, to Potomac Edison and Mon Power. So FERC disapproved it, but the Public Service Commission went ahead and issued an order and said, we'd still go ahead and approve it, assuming the utilities can get approval from FERC. So this is a classic situation where they had an obligation to protect their ratepayers and plainly decided these decisions in a manner that protected the shareholders, frankly, and that rewarded the shareholders and didn't hold management accountable for the bad decisions of acquiring these coal plants in the first place, in the case of First Energy when they acquired Allegheny Power back in 2011. Finally, they have these annual power cost true-ups called expanded net energy costs. This is where the commission gets a chance to really review how the utilities are managing their power costs. They're supposed to be taking a close look at other options to be buying power at a cheaper rate at the wholesale markets versus operating uneconomical coal plants. This is one that the commission probably could be taking a closer look at these things. And in recent years, they've been a source of pretty big rate increases. Why? Because these three coal plants that got put into the regulated rate base aren't economical and they're causing ratepayers to have to pay more money. That's how it gets played out in terms of these ENEC filings, because when the plants are uneconomic, that means PJM's not going to dispatch them, which means the ratepayers are going to pick up the balance of the cost of carrying those plants in the regulated rate base. So it's pretty much highlighting why First Energy and AEP wanted to unload those plants in the first place. So the last thing is the PSC does have authority when you want to cite wind facilities, utility scale solar, electric transmission lines. The PSC has these hearings where they issue what's called certificates of convenience and necessity. So they do have a role in terms of looking at the environmental impacts of renewable projects and citing decisions regarding electric transmission lines. I think that's, the Consumer Advocate Division. Just real briefly, this was created about 30 years ago, I guess now. So this is the entity that's is a party to most of the rate cases in front of the Public Service Commission. They are charged with representing the interests of residential customers, and it's a division of the PSC. It's independent from the PSC. It has its own separate budget and staff. The director, of course, is appointed by the PSC commissioners. So question as to how much independence this entity really has. This structure is unlike most other states where the Consumer Advocate does not report to the commissioners. Final slide. So most recently, Jackie Roberts was in this position. She left the Consumer Advocate Division to go to the Public Service Commission. So Robert Williams was recently appointed back in February to be the new consumer advocate. So to the extent when the utilities are filing rate cases, this is the guy who's charged with putting on an opposing case to protect ratepayers from what the utilities want to do. And this slide gives a little bit of his background. He's been in Charleston in a variety of positions on both the legislative side and at the Public Service Commission in the 80s and 90s. And with that, I'll answer questions at the end of the webinar. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Jamie. That was great. It's a very educational presentation, a lot of information, and we kind of want to bring the focus down to some real world examples of how citizens can interact with these regulatory bodies and put some pressure on utilities to make sure that our interests and rights are being well represented against these very powerful interests. And so I'm going to turn it over to Karan Ireland next to talk about putting that public back in public service commissions. Love it, Karan. Take it away.
Thanks, Autumn. Thanks for having me here. I will tell you that in going through some of these examples, it kind of restored my faith. A lot of this information that we've gotten so far can be bleak and overwhelming. And I wanted to talk about what people can do in the real world to go to these venues and advocate for change. These photos, oh, sorry, go ahead. Those are people at public hearings across the state about the Pleasance power station bailout. So we'll get to that in a minute. Next slide. So the two groups that I want to talk about and the two campaigns I want to talk about, I'm going to take us away from energy for a little bit to talk about water utility and a group called Advocates for a Safe Water System that sought to put pressure on the commission to launch a general investigation into West Virginia American Water, which is one of our largest water suppliers here in West Virginia. And then we're going to talk about West Virginians for Energy Freedom, a group that is now fighting to get PPAs legalized in West Virginia. But early on in 2017 and before, we're advocating against the Pleasance power station transfer. Next slide. Okay, Advocates for a Safe Water System. So some of you who might not be from West Virginia may not know that we had a major chemical contamination in 2014. And actually my background is not in energy or environmental science or anything, but I was a person that was affected by the chemical leak. I couldn't use my water to drink or bathe in or clean, could only use it for flushing toilets. I had 2 young children at the time. And I became very active then in trying to hold my government officials accountable and the utilities and the company that also allowed this leak to happen. So that's where I became involved. And I became involved in a group called Advocates for a Safe Water System. You can move to the next slide. So a lot of different people became active at the time. Some people were focusing on environmental legislation regulating above ground storage tanks. Some people were active trying to learn what MCHM, the chemical that leaked into the water, would do to our public health. But a group called Advocates for a Safe Water System became interested in what would a safe and resilient water system look like? How did our system differ from that? And who were the entities in charge of regulating the system? And the main thing that I used to tell people is West Virginia American Water used to say, oh, well, we were a victim. We had no way of controlling whether or not this chemical would leak into our drinking water source. But they made a lot of decisions, one of which was to pump that contaminated water through our treatment system. And they were unable to turn off their intake because of decisions they'd made leading up to that time. You can go on. So the group first sought to help folks file informal and formal complaints with the PSC. We helped 26 people file formal complaints, and we created a letter and entreated some of our legislators to send it to the Public Service Commission encouraging them to start a general investigation into the water company's role in the water crisis. So you'll see there that we also intervened in the rate case that happened kind of during the case of the the course of the investigation. We held all kinds of public forums. The photo in the middle at the bottom was a group of folks who were actually, we created our own water invoices and took them to West Virginia American Water for all of the expenses that we incurred during the time that we were unable to use our water. And then at the end, we ultimately pivoted to a campaign for a public water system. And I'll talk a little bit about that going forward. You can go ahead. I'll mention that one of the PSC's most effective tools is the general investigation. And in a general investigation, the PSC requests a full accounting of a particular situation from the relevant utility, and other parties to the case can request information of the utility and make recommendations to the PSC about how to resolve problems. So that's why we thought that the general investigation into the decisions, some of which happened decades before the water crisis, might shed some relevant light on West Virginia American Water. But we used a lot of fun tactics. You'll see on the left our sticker, Public Water for the Public Good. We put on the construction cones. We encouraged folks to send in their photos of leaks of the week, the leak of the week. If you had a main break in your neighborhood, we wanted to see pictures of them. And then we tied that to the failure of the utility to replace mains. We did canvassing. We applied pressure to the county commission to ask them to intervene in cases and send letters to the PSC. And ultimately, we even put our own ads in the paper. We can go on. Some of the challenges we had. So this is former chairman Mike Albert. He worked for a law firm called Jackson Kelly. Prior to his tenure at the PSC, Jackson Kelly represented West Virginia American Water, as did Mike Albert personally, worked on those cases, and we'll see some other utilities that he worked for later on down the line. Also, we had encouraged the commissioner to recuse himself and during the investigation, because he was counsel during some of the time that critical decisions had been made by West Virginia American Water. And only after a vacancy was coming up did he agree to do that, leaving the commission with one commissioner to hear the investigation, which caused the case to drag on to sit dormant actually for about a year. You can go on. Ultimately, so we lost a little bit. We intervened in rate cases, and during the course of the investigation, we pointed out, that our priorities were not necessarily the same priorities as West Virginia American Water, and that West Virginia American Water was responsible to their shareholders, and we needed them to be responsible to the public they served. But they were ultimately granted a 15.1% increase, and then very quickly afterwards, a 1.9% surcharge that allowed them to get an expedited cost recovery. So there are some there's some defeats along the way. You can move on. But we were very happy with the investigation results. So we, in January 2017, the case settled because the parties involved, not necessarily advocates for a safe water system, but others believed that this was a better outcome than would have been ordered by the PSC. And you can see that there are actual tangible improvements that the utility was required to make. We agreed with that assessment. We were, however, disappointed that we have a regulatory system that kind of forces us to choose between making these improvements and getting the full accounting of what happened. So for that purpose, we kind of sat out the settlement. We neither supported it, nor did we oppose it. We did pivot at that time to running a campaign to try to apply public and political will towards a regional water authority. We even brought in the mayor of Missoula, Montana, to talk to some of our legislators and county commissioners and mayors and the general public to talk about how that city and other government entities were able to create public systems, whether it was remunicipalization or creating new public systems. That campaign has petered out. There was not the political will to do that, but I'm still interested if anyone wants to get involved. You can go on. That brings me to West Virginians for Energy Freedom. So long before Governor Justice signed the tax break that was mentioned before for Pleasance, Ohio-based First Energy sought to transfer the Pleasance plant, owned by its unregulated subsidiary, Allegheny Energy Supply, to their regulated subsidiaries in West Virginia. We first heard about it on an earnings call, and then when they, you can move on, sorry. But when they filed their IRP in 2015, they overstated the future energy needs and advocated for the purchase of additional coal-fired generation, dismissing lower cost alternatives like demand response, energy efficiency, and renewables. So this is kind of the timeline. I hope that everyone can keep those in your notes, but at that time, Solar United Neighbors of West Virginia, and I worked for Solar United Neighbors at the time, and West Virginia Citizen Action Group filed a motion to intervene. They also filed a sign-on letter in response to First Energy's motion to dismiss, and the group that signed on to that letter became the basis for First Energy, or West Virginians for Energy Freedom. You can move on. And here are some of the campaign strategies we used. We held public forums about the plant transfer so that we could educate residents about what the case was about, what it was going to do to bills, and start conversations at the community level. The basic message of the campaign was that it was a sham, and it was a corporate bailout for an out-of-state company that would burden West Virginia ratepayers. And we took our message all over First Energy territory, which was great fun. We met with county commissions, city councils, progressive organizations, Democratic women's groups, many others to talk about the transfer and answer their questions. And so that's some of this you can see here, but one of the main victories we had at that time is we mounted a massive effort to have the PSC hold these public hearings across the state. So one of the things that the PSC often does is say, yes, we'll hold a public hearing in Charleston, which is 5 hours away from Eastern Panhandle and 3 hours away from Morgantown, and away and in APCO territory, not even First Energy territory. So, you know, we wanted people to be able to come out and speak to this who were actually going to be affected by it. And you can move on. And again, we had some fun with things. The PSC was so outdated at that time that you could not submit comments by email. You could fax them. And so we had a fax the PSC day. We hired an actor, actually in this case, it's my son, to don a cape and be the energy freedom fighter and deliver petitions and letters to the PSC. We used the Solar United Neighbors Solar Congress and other community meetings to talk about what is the PSC, who is First Energy, what is this case, and so we had a really fun time doing this work. You can move on. Challenges, again, shockingly, Chairman Albert, during his tenure at Jackson Kelly, also worked on utility issues that affected Mon Power and Potomac Edison. We also had to worry about campaign contributions and the pressure that might be applied on the PSC from legislators or the governor receiving campaign contributions from this massive corporation. There's also challenges related to the history of coal in West Virginia. Anytime you're trying to do anything related to power plants in West Virginia, you can count on the Coal Association and coal-friendly folks to come out and talk about how this is going to help coal. So you can move on. Okay, so we, though, felt very, very victorious when FERC handed down a decision in January of 2018 that denied First Energy's request because of cross-subsidy concerns. And then after that, shortly after that, the PSC decision, even though they approved the Pleasant sale, they approved it with conditions aimed at protecting customers from financial and legal risks. And the company would have had to meet those conditions before moving on. We contended that they could not do that. So I remember when I heard the FERC decision and just pulled my car over and texted my campaign cohorts, and it was very exciting. And you can go on. But as is the way with energy and utility issues, especially in West Virginia, there's always a step or two backwards. And of course, we heard about the bill that Jim Justice signed to exempt them from B&O taxes. And then worse than that, legislation the next year applied to plants that that would, like, particularly I'm thinking of Mount Storm in Grant County, that gave them another break. And even now, today, there's a bill at the legislature that is meant to prop up coal. And then there's one that's hopefully dead, meant to benefit coal-fired power plants and utilities. So you can move on. And this is how you can contact me. I want to let you know that we are intervening in a case at the Public Service Commission now, arguing against the company's application for a certificate of need to make environmental upgrades, rather than looking at a buildup of renewables and setting retirement dates for some of its plants. And there will be ways to engage the public in that. And I thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Karen, for giving us some examples of citizen action and advocacy and ways to get involved. We're running right up against our time here, and I'm really pleased with all the information we were able to share. Thank you, Dave, Jamie, and Karen for taking time out of your day, and for everyone who's been here over your lunch break to learn a lot, hopefully, about our utility system and its regulation and how to be involved. If you're inspired to get involved, I encourage you to visit solarunitedneighbors.org. You can sign up for our mailing list to stay up to date on advocacy opportunities. You can sign up for our volunteer list so you are alerted to volunteer opportunities coming up. And also check out energyfreedomwv.org, the West Virginians for Energy Freedom website that Karen mentioned. We had a question about ongoing legislative issues during this session, and our focus on on-site power purchase agreements is at the last moment gaining some traction. There was a PPA bill just voted out, originated in and voted out of the House Judiciary Committee on Friday. So it will be on the House floor this week. So tune in to the floor debate tomorrow if you're interested in hearing that, and it'll be voted on Wednesday. You can let your legislators know you support that and get involved for updates at energyfreedomwv.org. And then if there are other questions that weren't answered, Liz, we've got a minute if anyone wants to stick around we can answer a few more questions. And for those of you who do have to leave at 1:30, thank you so much for joining us. Opening the chat here to see if there are other questions.
Yeah, there haven't been a lot of questions, Autumn. There was one about if the process was the same for water and other utilities, and Jamie answered that and said that it was basically, it's the same process.
Oh, okay, the process to appeal or to complain about things to the PSC, right? So the PSC, you know, this is a regulatory body overseeing all of our utilities, not just electricity, which has been the focus of this and most of our work, but as Karan pointed out, you know, water and gas, any public utilities are regulated by this authority. Let's see if there's other questions coming in.
There's a question about interconnection. Autumn, I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, okay, we've got a question about electric utility rules for PV and storage interconnections. Methods for how PV systems make connection to electrical service. So I would defer to Jamie about the specifics of the PSC's authority over rulemaking, but my understanding is that the PSC does have the authority to make these rulemaking decisions about interconnection specifically. So there are these parallel systems where the state electric code and the fire office, you know, has their rules, and then the PSC also has the authority to make those rules. Am I right on that, Jim?
Yeah, I tried to file an answer to that in the chat, but basically it's the interconnection standards. I mean, the PSC really pretty much oversees the relationship between the utility and its customers, and the utility really can't do anything as far as changing interconnection rules or imposing requirements unless the PSC approves it. So they had proceedings to adopt these interconnection standards generally, and then the utilities should be incorporating those into their tariffs. And those are all on file. If you just like Google Mon Power, West Virginia tariffs, you can see, and they'll have the language in there that applies, but the PSC is involved overseeing that. So the question was, can they make these rules up as they go along? No, there's nothing that utility can do with respect to changing interconnection requirements that the PSC doesn't review and have an opportunity for to have hearings and a process in front of the commission.
Thank you, Jamie. I also see Mayor Cavalier from the city of Smithers. Hi, Mayor Ann. She wants to set up her own solar plant in Smithers and sell the excess power to public utilities. I think that'd be a great idea. It would require deregulating our monopoly vertically integrated utility system as it currently exists in some way, shape, or form. So sort of a big bite to chew, but I would love for more municipalities to be able to benefit from the sale of solar energy if they're able to do that. My 2 cents.
Well, and it's something that could be potentially addressed in legislation next year. If this solar, we got a decent SB 583 got passed last year. We're looking at a PPA bill this year, as Autumn mentioned, but I think there's getting to be more traction for solar, and it seems to be that could be a logical next step for a bill next year, is to give municipalities the ability to build their own solar arrays and sell the excess back into the grid. But it's gonna be something that the legislature would have to do because current law does not allow it. And if the current law doesn't allow it, the PSC is not gonna take a creative reading on its own to permit it.
Well, because we are over time, I'm going to wrap it up here and thank our panelists again, Dave, Jamie, and Karan, for your time. Thank you all for taking time out of your day to attend. And if you have follow-up questions, we will be sharing the recording, so you'll have access to everyone's contact information. And I do encourage you to get involved, stay involved, and thank you for your advocacy for your rights here in West Virginia around energy issues. Have a great day, everyone.